right. Well, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Burgess. I work at the Allegheny County Conservation District. And assuming you're in the right place, this is Soil Health 101 for urban gardeners and homeowners. Thank you for joining us. There's another staffer on here with me, Amy Miller, and she will be handling the questions, which we were just asking you to please type into your chat box. So there's a chat box feature in your Zoom control panel. If you don't see it, it may be under the More tab, and you can bring up the chat box, and Amy will be taking note of the questions in there and kind of storing them, and then we'll get through them each one by one at the end. I'm going to turn my video off now, and we'll just focus on the PowerPoint, and we will get started. Thank you all very much for joining us. So, this is the agenda for today. Because we're talking about Soil 101, we're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to define soil. And then once we do that and understand a little bit about what we're talking about, we're going to move into soil composition. So what is soil made of? What are the particles that define soil texture? We're going to get into soil health. What does that mean, and what do we mean by saying that? We're going to talk about properties of soil, so the nutrients and organics and other issues that may cause soil to function either well or poorly. We're going to talk about what makes urban soils unique. So what special considerations or activities are occurring in urban areas that maybe make the soils there a little more different on the whole than you would find in other environments. We're going to talk about soil testing, so the types of testing, where you can get a test, and the usefulness of those tests. We're going to cover some strategies to improve soil, so what do you do once you get a test back? And then we're going to open it up for some questions at the end. As a reminder note for the folks that are just joining us, because we have a number of people on the webinar today, we're asking you to please type your questions in the chat box feature. So Amy from our office is going to be monitoring that, and she'll compile them and ask them at the end so we can cover everybody's questions. So first and foremost, what is soil? Well, according to the Soil Science Society of America, who have a lovely alliterative mouthful of a name, soil is broken up into two definitions. And I really enjoy this process because it defines a couple of things that make soil unique. The first definition is that soil is simply the unconsolidated mineral or organic material on the immediate surface of the earth that serves as a natural medium for the growth of land plants. This is a fairly basic definition. Soil is a mix of different sized particles, which is what unconsolidated means, and it's composed of minerals and organics, and plants grow in it. And that's fairly straightforward, but it kind of gives the implication that soil is simply a product of its origins, a product of its parenting. When we talk about soil, we often talk about parent material, but soil is more than that. It's not simply, the product of its source material. Soil is also, according to the second definition, subjected to and shows the effects of genetic and environmental factors like climate, so rainfall, temperature, the organisms, both macro and micro, that live in it, the relief, so is it on a hill or is it in a valley? And all of these things influence soil over time and create something that is unique in and of itself. It also means that soil isn't static. Soil has a history, but it also has a future. And that future can be influenced by these same forces or by mankind. So when soil, like a lot of living dynamic things, we often think about it both in terms of its origin, its nature, but also nurture, in the sense that the factors that influence and engage with it can turn it into something completely new. So the most basic thing to think of when we talk about soil is composition. And what you're looking at is essentially an idealized soil composition diagram. And so we have mineral particles. These are the weathered parent material in rocks that over time have turned into small particles in the soil. We have space occupied by air and water, often intermittently. And then we have organic matter. In here, the organic matter comprises 5% of the soil, but it includes both the humic layer, so the dark, rich, earthy, decomposed material that you think of when you think of, rich-smelling forest soil, or even compost in your garden, but also the roots of the plants that are growing in it. Those roots also die and decompose over time, and the organisms that occupy soil. But most basically, when we're talking about soil and the material that it comes from, we think about particles and texture. So this is absent many of the biological and chemical factors that we're going to be talking about later. But initially, we'll look at texture. And this is something that, if you want to know more about your soil, is a good place to start. Because soil is made up of all these different particle sizes, the balance and the amount of those sizes in relation, of those particles in relation to each other, can have a big influence on how it acts and reacts to changes in the environment. Generally speaking, soil is comprised of sand, silt, and clay, plus the organic material and air and water that we just covered. But those particles, sand, silt, and clay, are different sizes. So sand being the largest, visible to the naked eye, 2 millimeters down to a percentage of that at 0.02 millimeters. Silt, smaller still, 0.02 millimeters to 0.002 millimeters. We can also talk about these in terms of microns, which is an order of magnitude smaller than a millimeter. Clay is the smallest. These are the very, very fine particles that adhere to each other and tend to clump up. So you couldn't see a particle of clay, or probably even small silt, without a fairly decent microscope. Now, these are all in different mixes and different soils. Some soils are sandier, some soils are clay-rich, like we often see here in the Pittsburgh region. But generally speaking, when these soils are mixed in certain ways, they become what's called a loam. And maybe an idealized loam would be 40% sand, 40% silt, and 40% clay. But every soil is different. And a lot of times, when people want to understand where their soil texture falls, they'll use what's called this texture chart, the triangle on your right. The chart has 3 sides, and one side on the left is clay. And if you look at it, you'll see that clay goes from 0 at the bottom left corner, here where my mouse is, up to 100% at the top. Whereas silt goes from 0% at the top, down the right side of the triangle to 100% at the bottom, and sand goes from 0 to 100 right to left at the base. And what this is an easy diagram to help you, when you know the percentage of each of these in your soil, determine what your texture is like. So going to the loam mix that we had talked about earlier, that was 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay, we can see how the chart gets us there. 20% clay uses the lines running horizontally, so all the clay lines run across the triangle horizontally. We find the 40% in our silt category, and those lines run up at the top right, down, and left. Basically the same direction that the arrows are facing. Whereas sand, 40% here, goes from the bottom right towards the top left. And if you find the intersecting point where each of these lines meet, you'll see that they exist at the loam. So as these percentages change for each of the particles, you'll end up in a different category in this chart. And so it's an easy way to think about your soil, whether you have a silty loam or a silty clay loam, which is what a lot of garden soils are like here, or a clay loam, or just a whole lot of silty clay. You can determine all that by using this chart. But first you need to get to the percentages. So one of the easy ways to do a texture test of your soil is what's called the ball jar test. It's fairly basic. You can do it in a classroom, you can do it in your backyard, and it's really popular and common among a lot of gardeners. Really, all you need for this is a ball jar with a lid, a marker, a ruler, a timer, and some soil. And the way you use the texture test here is you fill the jar a third of the way up with your soil, and then you add water to just below the top of the jar. You could even go slightly higher than what you see here. And what happens is you add a tablespoon of dry laundry detergent to help the particles break up so they don't stick together. And then you shake the jar really hard for 30 seconds. So the water in your soil turns into a muddy slurry. You set the jar down, and then you set a timer. After 1 minute, you'll be able to mark the line at the base where the sand has settled. Sand being the largest particles will settle first. So you'll take, say, a Sharpie marker and mark that line where the top of the sand is. Then you'll wait until the 45-minute mark, and you'll mark where the silt has settled, the second layer and the next particle size down. And then after 2 hours, you'll mark where the clay has settled. Sometimes there'll be some maybe clear water, or more likely or not, some organic material floating on the surface, but you should be able to distinguish where the layers separate out if you give it time. And then after the fact, you can take a ruler or use the graduation if you're lucky enough that there's enough of it on your jar, and figure out how tall it is from the base of the sand to the top of the clay, and then measure the width of each of the sections. So for instance, if it's 5 inches from the base of the sand at the bottom of the jar to the top of the clay layer, and I can determine that the sand is 2 inches thick, the silt is 1 inch thick, and the clay is 2 inches thick, I can rough out percentages. In this scenario, it would be 40% sand, 20% silt, and 40% clay. If we were to go back to our texture chart, we can see that that would put us at the intersection of a clay loam, a silty clay, or a silty clay loam. It's a fairly basic test, but it's an easy way to kind of see what the particle distribution of your soil is. There are other tests as well. Although we're not going to get into them too much here, but I will, after the presentation is done today, probably tomorrow morning, email you with resources and a survey and some of these links in case you want to dig into it a little further. This texture test is sort of a texture by feel, and the wording of each of these boxes is a little small for you, but essentially it's a decision tree that has you do things by feel with the soil. So rolling it into a ball with your hand. You know, if it was pure sand, it wouldn't hold the ball shape. You need some clay in there to hold things together, so that helps you determine whether or not it's pure sand. You might want to push it between your index finger and your thumb and make a ribbon, and push that ribbon out from your thumb and forefinger. And if it breaks off, it probably doesn't have much clay in there. It's probably, you know, a pretty good amount of silt and sand. And then, you know, as you move further on, you can feel for grit between your fingers to determine, you know, the grittiness, how much sand is in there. We don't often recommend this one as a starting point for gardeners because it really involves holding the soil with your hand and your bare hand. You need to be able to feel and work the soil on your bare skin. So for a lot of urban soils, which is a focus of the topic today, we don't know if there's lead contamination or bits of broken glass or things like that. So oftentimes the ball jar test is the easiest way to go. But if you are interested in this and you feel confident and comfortable about the soil in your yard, we'll be sending this texture chart to you in the email afterward along with other resources, and please feel free to give it a try. So once you've determined the texture of your soil, we get to start thinking about soil health. And people ask all the time, what is soil health? What is healthy soil? Well, the Natural Resource Conservation Service defines it as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And what it means is that this soil is operating and functioning in all the ways that can be sustainable long-term to plant growth and to human health and environmental health. Healthy soil can generally be thought of in 3 main categories. A soil that is healthy has appropriate biological properties, it has good chemical properties, and it has good physical properties. And we'll get into these in detail, but in general, it's the 3 of these things working together that gets you a healthy soil. It may not be the same for every soil, depending on what the environment is like or the particular use you want to get out of it, but they all have to work in concert in some way or fashion to get you where you want to be. So when we talk about biology in soil, the most common thing that you'll hear is the soil food web. And this is the big picture look at biology in soil. You know, everything from the plants that grow on the surface, to the roots and leaves and matter that decompose underground, to the fungi and bacteria and microscopic nematodes that feed on decomposing matter and help to facilitate, you know, the interactions between the plants and the soil and water and air. You have the bigger class of creatures that live in the soil, larger protozoa and arthropods, things that maybe eat the smaller microbes in the soil or even eat plants in some cases. Then you step up into bigger predators, things like earthworms or arthropods, and then even bigger still, the animals and birds that eat them. And what this is essentially showing you is that soil is somewhat more than a singular process or a line It's a whole system that is dependent on all the aspects of the system to function properly. So you have carbon and nitrogen inputs, everything from the atmospheric inputs to decomposed matter to maybe things that people are adding to the soil. You have all these microbes, you have all these macroorganisms. And they're really working together to get you the functions that you need in your soil. Decomposition, good organic matter that can be used by plants, mineralized, structure and porosity, so air and water can move through the soil, as well as roots. And the nitrogen cycling that is so important to, good environmental health. But beyond the biological properties of soil, there's also the chemical properties. And these are one that are probably most common to people because we're talking about nutrients and pH. So with chemical properties, we kind of classify it in three ways. We'll talk about macronutrients, which are the big ones that plants depend on in larger amounts. We'll talk about the micronutrients, essential, but not necessarily required in the same volume as the macros. We'll talk about pH, or soil acidity, and what that means for nutrients in the plants, as well as contaminants that might be in the soil. But all of these things really work together to give plants the fuel that they need, to provide a comfortable home for microbes, and to control the rate of nitrogen or phosphorus loss that you might get in your soil. So you want nutrients to be there, but you want them to stay there so that they can be available to plants when needed. And you want the beneficial microbes to be able to operate in that environment. And they are sometimes sensitive to changes in the chemical composition of your soil. So for macronutrients, most people are familiar with the big three. These are N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They're essential for things like growth, photosynthesis, energy transfer, disease prevention, fruit production, photosynthesis, and building proteins. So fairly essential. And close behind them, and also key to plant growth and healthy soil, are things like calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, which help plants grow strong and have good cellular wall structure so they can grow tall and reach sunlight. It helps them transport nutrients and water, the xylem and the phloem construction of your plants. Magnesium helps with photosynthesis and activation of enzymes. And sulfur helps with protein production, growth, and plant resilience and chlorophyll formation. So these are the macronutrients. And a lot of times, with main fertilizers and amendments that you add to your soil, they'll be built around these because they're the most common ones that you're lacking for plants. And they're also the ones most commonly tested for. But in smaller amounts, but still as important, are the micronutrients. These are things like boron, and copper, iron, manganese, zinc, molybdenum, which isn't on here. And a lot of these have really important relationships to plant function and soil function. So soil that has a good balance of micronutrients will be able to help plants regulate nutrient uptake and sugar and carb production, or reproductive growth, metabolism, chlorophyll production, breaking down carbs and transforming them. So these are the micronutrients. So between the macronutrients and the micronutrients, you have a pretty important component of soil chemistry. But also, you have the acidity. And this is one that people are often a little curious about and maybe uncertain as to the benefits of. But the chart below illustrates it quite well, I think. I mean, acidity is essentially, is your soil acidic, so like an acid or lemon juice, or alkaline? And the range is from 0 to 14, but obviously at the extremes, that's not something that plant life can be sustained in. So what you're looking at here is the 4 pH to the 10.0 pH, and a list of nutrients, both macro and micro. And the thickness of the lines on this chart that you see on the left of your screen relate to the availability of these various nutrients at different pHs. So as you can see, going down right the middle of the chart, or even slightly to the left, which is very slightly acidic, you have a pretty good balance of availability across all these different nutrients. As you get too acidic, some nutrients maybe become over-available, like the iron, or, as is the case with most of the rest of them, they taper off in availability as it gets strongly acidic. And the same holds true for the other direction. It's a bit of the Goldilocks scenario. So it can't be too acidic or too alkaline. It needs to be just right so the plant can get a nice balance of the nutrients that it needs. In general, when we talk about gardening and healthy plants, we are looking at that 6 to 7, or even 7.5 range, depending on what you have in your soil. That's where you're going to get the widest array of nutrients that you need. And there are additional benefits to that as well. A nice, somewhat neutral pH can also limit the availability of contaminants like lead. And it is fair to note that urban soils tend to have a high pH. So a lot of times if you're working in soil in an urban environment, you haven't done anything to it, haven't been growing in it, you'll see that the pH upon first testing it is often quite high. I see a lot of 8.0 and 8.5s here in the city of Pittsburgh. And that's really, to a large degree because of the calcium and concrete that is in limestone, that is in urban environments. All the fill material and construction material can boost that pH up. And sometimes that means that in order to grow successfully in it, you need to lower the pH to get the most out of your soil. So beyond chemical, we have the last of these three properties, which is physical. And we touched on physical a bit earlier when we talked about soil texture. But there's more to it than simply the size of the particles that your soil is composed of. There's also the addition of organic matter. What is the percentage of organic matter in relationship to the sand, the silt, and the clay that's in your soil? What is the soil structured like? Is there room for roots and water and air to work their way down into it? Is it completely loose, or is it aggregated into somewhat larger clumps like you can see kind of in the top right of this soil here or in the bottom right? Or is it so compacted that there is no room for anything to move through it? Just a solid lump of clay, which a lot of you might be familiar with from your gardening work or work in any sort of environment in this area. Organic matter also helps because if it's there, it can improve the holding capacity. Certain soil particles will retain water better because they provide space for water to move through and be stored in, whereas other types of soil, particularly high clay soils, may, because they are composed of such tiny particles of clay, compact down together, leaving little room for air or earthworms or roots or water to work their way down, which is why on a lot of, say, urban lots that are highly compacted and full of clay, you don't see a lot of water infiltration. And in a lot of places where compaction has occurred, like in the picture on the right, you can see that water is unable to be infiltrated anymore in that field. It has reached a full saturation. And so it has nowhere to go but downhill, in this case into the grass and potentially into culverts and streams, carrying whatever it can with it. You can see bulk density listed as a physical property too, and some of these terms can be a little repetitive because there are different ways of examining the same thing. Bulk density can simply be how much of that pore space has been reduced in your soil, so how much mass is in a given volume. But some people will simply use infiltration tests or other types of examinations like a penetrometer to see what the compaction of the soil is. So there's sort of different terms that kind of get at the same concept. But when we talk about soil carbon and organic matter, we just spoke about it in a physical sense in terms of structure and water retention, but it also has influences on these other functions. So there is crossover between characteristics of soil. It's not as though organic matter only has importance for physical structure of soil. It also helps to provide nutrients, improves the resilience for plants because water can be stored in that organic matter and the soil won't dry out as quickly. It can be a home for microbes and other creatures that help to facilitate nutrient cycling and healthy productive soil. And from a chemical standpoint, some of the organic matter in soil carbon can immobilize pollutants or bind heavy metals and help to buffer the pH so that you are a little more resistant to swings in soil acidity. But beyond the biological, chemical, and physical issues that you would normally look at in a typical soil, we also have a large variety of urban soil issues. And while urban areas may be blessed with a high degree of social services or entertainment and restaurants, they're also blessed with a host of negative soil issues that have to be considered and addressed. And chief among these is compaction. It's not hard in an urban environment to imagine feet and bicycles and cars and homes and construction equipment and all these things just driving over and then pushing down on the surface of the soil. And what this can happen and lead to over time is compaction that will inhibit the depth that roots can grow, or it will squeeze all that air and water pore space out, leaving no room for microbes or roots. And so you'll get occasionally things like you see at the right, where you have this sort of thin organic layer at the top with some grass and a few roots, and then as you get down, the soil is fairly flattened, and there's very little space for things to work their way through. Another urban soil issue that we're faced with is low organic carbon. And this exists for a couple of reasons. The turf management, just the way people treat, their lawns and cutting grass and taking the clippings away. But it's also because there's a lot of fill in urban environments. We really, when we build houses and structures and infrastructure in urban environments, we don't want the soil to settle all that much afterwards. We don't want foundations to crack or roads to slump. And so we're tending to use a very compacted base that is often very clay rich because it's being dug out of the ground in other places at a deeper depth than you would normally find a lot of organic carbon. So they're bringing this subsoil, this clay rich soil or this nutrient deficient soil up out of the pit where they're putting the foundation, and it becomes fill material to use underneath people's turf in their yards or under roadways, or to fill vacant lots after a house is demolished and you have to now fill in the foundation. This can also lead to things like nutrient deficiencies. And when you have nutrient deficiencies in urban soils, you tend to get the plants that can survive in those nutrient deficient environments. Compacted soil and low amounts of N, P, and K might be a bit much for some of the native flowers and trees and vegetables that we would like to see in our city, but they work pretty well for some weeds and invasives. They don't need to go particularly deep, or they don't need to have a particular amount of rainfall or nitrogen to survive. They can handle these tougher environments, and so they outcompete. And that's why a lot of times, with a lot that's left vacant in the city or a space that's left untended, these are the plants that will take over and dominate, the scrubby, hardy survivors. You also in urban soils find a lot of artifactual fill or just fill material. These are the things like brick and pieces of concrete. For those of you not from the Pittsburgh area, slag is a byproduct of steel making. It's a waste product. And for years here, they would just let people come and take it away to use as fill material. And so you'll find this sort of obsidian or crumbly coal-like material in the ground in lots of places, and that's slag. And you'll also just find trash, and any of you have seen a construction site, you can imagine trash gets left behind or things blow around and they end up in the hole that's being filled, and so later on, if you were to dig that up, you might find all kinds of things: old Pepsi bottles, cigarette packs, and plastic bags. And all of these things also lead to a lack of biodiversity. There's just not a lot of nutrients, not a lot of pore space, a lot of compaction, just frankly not a good environment for a lot of microbes to live in, or a lot of other soil organisms. And then you also get things like salinity. We use a lot of road salt in the city, a lot of road spaces, impervious surfaces, driveways, and sidewalks. And this salt often ends up in the soil. And when that happens, the salinity can gunk up some of the pore space. So it can reduce the amount of air and water that are able to work their way down in the soil. And that can cause real problems for plant growth as well. And then lastly, we have contamination. So urban soils certainly have their fair share of contamination, not uniformly, but in a larger amount than you would find in other parts of the world. So contamination in this sense tends to mean the big ones, which we look at as heavy metals. And in a place like Pittsburgh, these are going to be the types of things that are left behind because of industrial activity or aging infrastructure in homes, or some of the types of wood and materials that we may have built with in the past. So there are some heavy metals. I mean, these are all naturally occurring elements that you see on the screen before you, so they do exist in nature. Many of them tend to exist in large volumes deeper underground than the surface of the earth, and we've brought them up, but they aren't entirely unnatural. So lead in Pennsylvania in soils could range anywhere naturally from, let's say, 0 parts per million to something like 60 or 70 parts per million, which is a fairly low level, but it's there. In this area, arsenic is not all that uncommon because of our underlying geology. So sometimes you'll see it in soil or in groundwater, but we've also added it to the surface in the form of pesticides like lead arsenate or treated lumber. Things like chromated copper arsenate were used to treat lumber, and if that process was done poorly, like on some cheap decking material or on some wood that you use to build a retaining wall or a raised bed, that can actually leach out for a couple feet. So you always want to be, especially around places like that have aging treated wood, to be a little cautious and think about whether or not arsenic is there and test for it. Arsenic is also a byproduct of industrial combustion, so some of it goes up in the air and settles down into the soil as it disperses and dies down. You have other things like chromium from steel mills or electroplating, also in treated lumber, and cadmium from pigments, plastics, and batteries. And then all the other types of waste products that you might find, old diesel cans, or say a spray paint can or something, just trash and things that end up being thrown out and deposited. But the big one is lead. Lead is very, very common in urban environments. We do a lot of testing of soil here in urban environments and suburban environments in the city, and it is by far, in a way, the most common thing we find. And partly that's because we used to put lead in everything. It was in paint, we used it for industry, we built our pipes out of it, we put it in our gasoline. And what this means is that lead, being an element, never goes away. It may change its form, but down to its elemental level, it will stick around forever unless you physically move it. And lead is toxic. It's a neurotoxin. It's very damaging, even in small amounts for children whose brains are developing. And so we want to be especially careful around urban soils when we're talking about children, particularly those between 0 and 6 years old, but all the way up into their teens as their brain is still developing. Lead in the urban environments is in the soil. It tends to stay in place. And so a lot of times when it moves, the easiest way is on dust. So we can see it blowing around, especially if you have bare soil and the wind is coming through, and that lead contaminated dust will kick up and get on things like plants and vegetables or blow into people's doorways and be tracked into their homes. Sometimes at a lower pH, like if a soil is particularly acidic, lead can enter the plants in decent amounts as to cause damage if you eat those plants. It tends to work its way up from the ground. So the roots will have the highest amounts of lead, typically, then maybe the stem, then the leaves, and lastly the fruit. So when we are concerned with lead, or if you're uncertain if the soil has any lead, generally speaking, you can feel safer eating and consuming a vegetable the further away you get from the source. So root vegetables, stem vegetables, greens like spinach or arugula or mustard greens, you're kind of moving away from the home of that lead up out of the ground. And so fruits tend to be the safest thing to eat in contaminated soil. And we'll talk about this a little bit further on, and I'll provide some resources in an email after the fact about which fruits and vegetables are safer to grow in environments that have some lead. But in general, something like a tomato is going to be much, much safer than a bunch of spinach or arugula or a carrot. And lead contamination is not uniform across the city. Because paint is the primary driver here, as well as gasoline, you are more likely to find lead in the city if you are in and around a pre-1978 home or next to a road that's been used, somewhat heavily for decades. Leaded gasoline was phased out late 80s, early 90s, but particularly roads that have seen car traffic throughout the bulk of the 20th century, you will sometimes find significantly elevated lead levels in the strip of land just adjacent to those roads. Here's a diagram that shows how lead distribution tends to look, and it's not perfect, and you shouldn't assume that the middle of your yard is going to have no lead because you don't always know what used to be there. But in general, you'll see elevated levels, as I said, near the roads. Open spaces will be slightly lower, and the drip lines of houses will be elevated, and then it fades off again into whatever background levels have been built up from industrial and other sources over time. Again, this is a rough guide. You shouldn't take it as gospel, but if you are planning to, say, put beds or do some digging right up against your house, that's a place of significant risk and it's worth looking into. And in the same vein, if you're doing something like, say, planting vegetable beds near the road or the driveway of a place that's been heavily trafficked for decades, you're going to want to think about lead contamination there as well. So we've talked a little bit about texture and the biological and chemical and physical properties of soil. And the next step really to understanding your soil is soil testing. It's the first step to getting a picture of your soil health, and it's also an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing because soil, as we talked about at the beginning, is also dynamic and it changes and its needs change. So you're going to want to do a test at the beginning before you get going, and then maybe every year or as problems pop up, you see particular issues with your plants or getting grass to grow, or you have certain types of diseases that are common. But soil testing is a good return on investment. It will save you money in the long run because knowing exactly what your soil needs means that you can only spend money on those things. You won't spend too much or buy unnecessary products. You can target the needs of your soil in a very specific way. It's also fairly easy. Soil testing is not complicated because for the most part, you're just collecting the soil and sending it off to a qualified lab to have them do the work. It's not particularly expensive. A basic nutrient test may run you about $8. Something a little more expensive, like a fancier lead test, might cost you something like $27 to $30 with shipping and all the other fees. But for the cost of your safety and your sanity and your well-being, these are pretty low amounts. And if you're talking about buying things like tools or amendments or expensive fertilizers, those are probably going to cost you quite a bit more than the soil test. In general, though, it usually involves bagging and mailing your soil and sending it to the appropriate lab with a form filled out and your money. But there is a right way and a wrong way to take a soil sample. On the right is a diagram that I'll also attach in the email we're sending to everybody probably tomorrow morning, along with other resources and a survey. And this is something that we developed that just kind of shows a rough way to take soil samples in your yard. And there's some sort of bulleted instructions on the left for those of you who prefer to follow along that way. But in general, you want to split your yard or your lot or your space up into defined areas of interest. And that means don't just assume the entire yard is all the same, or that the beds on every corner of your house are all going to be the same, or that one side of the fence is the same as the other. You're going to want to define them and subdivide them. And once you've done that, say you have garden bed A and garden bed B and play area A, you can go into each of them and take a couple of soil samples. Sometimes people will take 5, sometimes people will take 10 if it's a slightly larger area. But usually the way we do it at the Conservation District is we'll take about 5 samples for every 100 square feet. And those samples get mixed together into one. So all the 5 samples from garden area A on the diagram on the right all go together. And you're basically creating a composite of that zone of your yard or that bed. It gives you a little bit of soil from all these different areas of the lot or all the different areas of that bed. And that's your representative sample for, say, garden area A. And you'll repeat that. Collect a few soil samples, make sure to get down, not just the surface. You want to get where the roots are growing, so maybe just below the grass or the surface, down about 6 to 8 inches for each of those scoops. Mix them all together, take about a cup of that, and that's your sample for sample A. You repeat that for the garden area B, maybe for the play area. As you can see in the diagram, you're not really interested in growing. You just want to know if maybe there's lead where your swing set is. You can stick to the shallow soil, the surface down about an inch or 2, because you're really, in that instance, only concerned about the soil at the top that your child may dig in or touch with their hands and then put in their mouth. But for garden areas, definitely go down from the surface about 6 to 8 inches. Try to get that whole profile of what your plants are going to be growing in. You take your composites, you mix them in the bucket, they go in a bag, maybe you dry them overnight on some newspaper, and then you can send it off to the lab. And most labs are going to ask for at least a half a cup per sample. Some will ask for 1 to 2 cups depending on the number of tests they're doing or how big of an area it's coming from. But in general, a cup is probably pretty good for nutrient testing. We usually do about a half a cup for lead testing. And so essentially, you just take these samples, mix them in a bucket, bag it, that's your first sample. Take your other scoops, mix them in a bucket, bag it, that's your second sample, and repeat as many samples as you need to do to cover all the distinct areas of your yard. Now, once you have these samples, you've got garden area A bagged up, garden area B bagged up, your play area bagged up. You're curious who to send them to. And in general, soil labs are operated by most land-grant universities with an extension system. So in our area, that's Penn State. They have an agricultural analytics lab that will do soil testing, environmental testing, all types of stuff. And they have forms that are more than ideal for homeowners and gardeners. If you're out of the state of Pennsylvania, or like a place like University of Kentucky will have a soil lab, or Cornell University in New York runs the extension service, and they have a great lab that does all kinds of amazing soil tests. Another popular one around here is the University of Massachusetts Soil Laboratory, because they have a nice sort of package deal where you can get kind of a quick and dirty lead test as well as your nutrients for about $15. I will note that right now with COVID lockdowns and social distancing and stay-at-home guidelines, the only one of these that I know is open for sure are Penn State and Cornell. UMass was closed, but Penn State is definitely open and prioritizing samples for food production. So particularly if you have a garden area, they will take your soil and test it for you right now, because they want to make sure that people are operating safely and successfully in a time where food is important to everyone. And typical supply chains are somewhat disrupted. So home gardening is especially beneficial. The conservation district where I work also does free screenings for lead, typically in the spring and the fall. This would be, you would just bring us your bag of soil. We would use a piece of equipment called an XRF. We would zap the soil and give you a pretty quick and dirty lead result. So we could tell you how much lead is in your soil in about 60 seconds. The problem is now is that we've typically done these in sort of a kind of a community-based way where people come and they mingle and they can talk to others or check out displays, or we'll partner with a community event. Obviously, that's not happening right now. We're trying to determine ways to be able to do this safely and socially distant in the future, perhaps a drop-off bin with a pre-printed form. So be on the lookout for that if you live in the Pittsburgh area. But for now, we aren't doing any public screenings. So you would have to rely on something like Penn State or Cornell to get a lead test. You can buy some home kits. People like Lamont sell them. You know, this would be a series of test tubes and solutions and sometimes strips that you can dip into your soil once you've shaken it up in the solution. It can give you a rough reading of things like pH or nitrogen or some of the other nutrients. It's a little less accurate than, say, a laboratory test or even the test that we do, but it is fairly fun, not too difficult. They're easy to follow instructions, and it can be sort of a great kind of family type science experiment where you can bust these home kits out and see what soil looks like in different areas. And it's fairly easy and straightforward to do. And they sell these kits for schools or just small ones that you can purchase on your own. Other types of testing can also be field equipment. So there are electronic sensors that you can buy that you can stick a probe in the ground and it will tell you the pH or what the current soil moisture is. Or we have a thing called a penetrometer, which is essentially a long probe with a gauge at the top, and you push it into the ground and it can tell you how compacted the soil is based on how hard you have to push to get the probe to go in. And these are nice and they're useful if you're doing a lot of soil testing, but they can have some cost as well. You know, a decent probe may cost you several $100s, and some of the other equipment could be, you know, around $100 or more. So if you're doing a lot of tests or you're really into this stuff, you may consider getting kind of a rapid piece of field equipment. But for most people, simply taking the test and sending them off to the lab is going to handle things for you. So you have sent it off to the lab. Maybe you printed off a form and you're wondering what types of tests they offer. I've put the ones in bold that we would commonly use, and those are the macronutrients. So the N, the P, the K, the nitrogen, the potassium, the phosphorus, the calcium, the magnesium, sulfur. So these are some of the macronutrients that you'll see in a lot of common kind of baseline soil tests. you may want to add on something like organic matter if it's not included, and that'll give you a great idea of like how healthy your soil is in terms of carbon and all of this rich material that supports your plant life. A lot of times, you know, soils and need an organic matter over 5% to be able to really do a good job with gardening, especially if you're doing something like biointensive gardening that requires, you know, plants being closer together, but a higher rate of nutrition in the soil going down deeper. Soil acidity is very, very common. So the macronutrients, the organic matter, the soil acidity is one that you'll probably want to look at. And then if you're testing for trace metals, I would just recommend lead to start. You could do some of these other tests as you get more into your soil, or you want to know specific questions. Maybe you have a concern about nutrient uptake or plant growth or flowering in your plant. You may want to start looking at micronutrients. Or if you see a lot of standing water, you could try to dig up a chunk of your soil and send it off to somebody like Cornell, who will do a bulk density analysis. There are some other tests too for things like salinity or cation exchange capacity, which is essentially the ability of your soil to retain the nutrients you're putting into it. Kind of goes on a scale from 0 to 50, you know, 0 being sand and 50 being clay, but it could be a good indicator sometimes of how well your soil is doing holding on to the nutrients that you're giving it. And then respiration as well, which is a measure of the biological activity. So how much, you know, carbon dioxide is being produced as a result of, you know, microbial digestion and activity in your soil. But again, the common ones that you're going to want to look at are organic matter, your macronutrients, soil acidity, and lead. Now, if you were to send something out to Penn State, you might get a test back like this. This is from an urban lot that we tested in the east end of Pittsburgh, I want to say a couple of years ago. And so what you're looking at is kind of what the top of the results sheet looks like when Penn State sends you your results. You can get them in the mail, or you can check a box and they'll just email you this form. And they have it done really nicely because they have your information at the top and then your soil nutrient levels. And so they'll essentially give you some numbers, which are pounds per acre of these macronutrients, which may or may not mean anything to you. But one of the benefits of Penn State and some of the other extension labs is when I sent my soil in, I said, I'm using this area for a mixed vegetable crop. So what they do is they have these nice bars here next to the numbers that show you in simple terms whether that particular nutrient level is deficient based on what you want to grow, in this case mixed vegetables, whether it's optimum, which only the phosphate is in this particular instance, or like the soil pH, potassium, magnesium, and calcium highly over what the crops need. So they exceed the levels that these crops need by quite a bit. And that's what we talked about, deficiencies and excess. Other tests wouldn't always look like this. A lot of tests would have, you know, deficient potassium or excessive soil pH, but this particular one just happens to be excessive in everything but phosphate. You can also select different crops. So say this particular area, I wanted to grow an apple tree, or I wanted to grow a blackberry bush, or I wanted to grow some sweet corn. You can put those. They'll have choices for each of them. So you can get really nitty-gritty with this, and they will give you instructions and recommendations for how to amend your soil down into the perfect optimum range for these various things. I didn't get nitrogen for this one. You have to add that with Penn State. But they did give me recommendations for phosphate and potash. And you can see that they're in these pounds per acre. So unfortunately, with this particular test, they're giving you kind of agricultural recommendations. So you would have to do a little calculator math. I don't think napkins would be the easiest way. And you'd have to convert that pounds per acre into something like maybe grams per square foot. So 180 pounds per acre would be a lot. And so for something like a raised bed that is maybe 40 square feet, 4 by 10, you would have to convert those acres to square feet. You know, acres roughly 42,000 square feet. You know, a pound is, you know, roughly, what, 27 grams. So you'd have to kind of do a little conversion and then figure out what exactly you need for your space. But there are some sort of online calculators that can help with converting pounds per acre to things like grams and square feet. And we'll try to put a link for those in the follow-up email as well, in case you ever need it down the road. If you were to get results from somewhere like UMass Extension, your soil test results might look something like this. You can see they have the pH in the top corner here. It was a 7.6, so a little high, but not as high as it is in other areas of the city or other tests. And this particular one, they're giving you a series of macronutrients and micronutrients, as well as aluminum and lead in this value found column here that I'm going up and over with my browser. And instead of the bars that you see in the Penn State test, they give you the optimum ranges in a column just to the right of your results. So you can kind of do the math that way. You can say, my potassium is 177 parts per million, and it's a little excessive. The range here that they're giving is between 100 and 160. And conversely, the calcium is far in exceedance of the recommended 1,000 to 1,500 parts per million that UMass gives you. So it's a rough approximation, but they're essentially telling you what an ideal setting for your soil would be, what an ideal nutrient range and presence would be, and you can kind of adjust from there. I will note that if you get a lead test from University of Massachusetts, they use a slightly different scale because of the test is different. So whereas we'll talk about lead levels that are at 150 or 400 or 1,000, they use a slightly more sensitive scale. So anything over 22 for them, because of the way they do the test, is excessive. So you can see this 72 parts per million here of lead is quite a bit over what would be considered safe for people to work in and for children to play around. Sometimes we'll go out and do extensive testing on sites here in the city. This one is from a potential site for actually, I think it was a new community garden in one of the neighborhoods. And this was a series of vacant lots that they were interested in using for that garden. And so we went in and just like I said, we did a test for every 100 square feet across these various vacant lots. And you can see there's a lot of variety here, a lot of lead. Everything that's yellow or red is over the safe limit for children, just to give you some idea of how common lead can be on vacant lots. But it would look something like this. So we give people results this way. We might give them a separate chart that lists all these numbers and shows the soil sample names that they're tied to. But a lot of times people feel that this is a little more labor intensive for us, but it helps people kind of look at the space in terms of management areas. They can say, you know, these corners of the yard at the top right are really not ideal and I need to treat those differently than these green spaces in the center. So if you were to ask us to map out a site for you at the Conservation District, it might look a little something like this. So you've sent out your soil tests, and you've asked the questions you wanted to ask of the laboratories, and what do you do with your results? So essentially, you have a few choices. One is you may just not like what you see and decide to grow elsewhere. You may say to yourself, this soil is not that great, it's not my first choice, or there are other places that I think I could try to grow in, so I'm just going to leave it be, throw some grass seed down, or leave whatever is there. Common one in the city is just to use raised beds. The soil below might not be ideal, and you don't really feel like digging out all the bricks or dealing with the compaction or addressing any lead contamination. So you simply cover the ground in mulch, put a little landscape fabric down, and build up a raised bed with clean soil. Raised beds are great. They're easy to manage. They look nice, and they make for a simple gardening setup. So they tend to be far and away the most popular thing you see in urban environments, especially when people are growing vegetables, but also flowers. Really concerns about lead and just wanting to mitigate or reduce any exposure potential for children is why in most community gardens you see raised beds. They can also be a little easier to work in, especially if you jack them up a little bit for those folks who might be older or not feel as comfortable bending over all the way to the ground. But beyond using raised beds, you could change what you grow. You could say that a certain area may not be suitable for vegetables, but you decide to throw some flowers in there, or you may cover it with grass or plant a tree and mulch around it. So results may give you ideas about what you want to grow in that particular space. The other thing you can do with results is make some changes. So follow those recommendations on the soil results and add amendments and things as needed, but you also might just need to make some physical changes. Soil can be compacted, so if you go through the trouble of doing an infiltration test or a bulk density test, or you just happen to notice that the soil seems really heavy and dense and water stands on the top, you might need to just break out the deep fork or the shovel or the tiller and really start to work that soil down into the ground so that physically the structure of it changes. You want to add some airspace or some pore space, or put some compost further down underneath the top layer of soil. And so these are the physical changes that you can do. And lastly, you may just want to amend your soil. When we talk about soil amendments, which we'll go into now, these are all the things you can buy and add to your soil that may both change the physical structure and composition of it, but also the chemical and biological characteristics. So for amendments, it's important to remember there's lots of options. You know, if you talk to 10 different gardeners, you'll probably get 10 different recommendations. People have a wide variety of preferences. There are lots of products. But in general, you know, you can look at them initially in terms of things that are organic and things that are chemical. So, you know, something like, say, you know, a synthetic Miracle-Gro versus, you know, an organic byproduct like compost or kelp meal or chicken manure. And there's going to be a lot of differences between the two of these. You know, if you buy something that is chemical, you know, a lot of times it is designed to have an impact fairly quickly. So if you add it to your soil, you're going to see results sooner, but they might not necessarily last as long. I mean, it's not hard to imagine that a commercial company would want you to keep coming back to purchase their products again and again. And the availability of all those nutrients in chemical amendments and fertilizers gets you a nice boost in your plant right away, but a lot of times you lose some of that fertilizer. It either goes down into the groundwater and is carried away, or it volatilizes and goes into the atmosphere. So you don't always get, you get immediate results, but you don't always get the most bang for your buck with chemical amendments. Organic ones are in a natural form, and so they may not be released and available to the plants right away. They may take a little while for the microbes and the soil chemistry to kind of influence those amendments so that the plants can take up the nutrients or that they can have benefits. But, you know, they're organic, which a lot of people prefer, especially in gardening situations, and they can have a longer impact. So if you were to add an organic amendment, you know, it might not seem many results for a few weeks, but you would see results sort of over a longer period of time. And amendments can do all types of things. You can adjust the acidity of your soil. You can add macro or micronutrients. You can change the texture. You know, you could add sand to soil to, you know, allow for a little more drainage and pore space like you see in a lot of rain gardens. Or you may want to add compost to a clay soil so that it doesn't get quite so sticky and water has some space to work through. Amendments can also do things like immobilize contaminants. You know, we talked about pH having a role to play and how available something like lead is. Low pH can often mean more available lead, but the amendments can do things like bind up that lead or bind up other contaminants or make them less immediately toxic to you. But like all things, moderation is key. Too much of a good thing is often a bad thing. So we want you to be smart when you're using amendments. Stick to the manufacturer's recommendations and certainly stick to the recommendations in your soil test. Adding too much is likely to throw things out of balance and cause more problems than it solves. But chief among amendments is compost. Compost is the king of amendments. It is by far and away the most useful thing that you'll be able to do to amend soil in your growing spaces in and around your home. There's different types of compost, which we won't really get into here. We'll save that for another presentation. But essentially, you know, there's mushroom compost, vermicomposting with worms, or thermophilic composting, which is what most people are familiar with, where you have a pile or a bin that you add a mix of brown material and green material and food waste and water and air, and you turn every so often, and that breaks down the material. But compost is great for a number of other reasons beyond the benefits it provides to soil. It repurposes food waste. If you were to throw a lot of your food waste away in a landfill, it would get buried, you know, in a big pile underground, you know, from the surface. The types of microbes that operate in landfills do so without oxygen in sort of anaerobic environments. And that means when they decompose and digest and break down a lot of these organics, instead of releasing things like carbon dioxide, they release methane gas, and so, which is a greenhouse gas and quite a bit more potent than carbon dioxide is in that sense. And so, you know, you're keeping this material out of the landfill when you compost. It can be a great source of nutrients. And it's important when it comes to nutrients to remember that compost is often carbon and nitrogen, and there are good ratios for building a compost pile where you balance carbon and nitrogen. But it also is a good source of micronutrients, but you get out of it what you put into it. A diverse supply of inputs into a compost bin is going to give you a better output of nutrients, especially micronutrients. You know, if you put things like broccoli stems and apple cores and banana peels in there, you're going to get a little wider variety of micronutrients. And that being added to your soil in your garden or your yard space can often prevent you from having to worry about testing specifically for those micronutrients or going out and purchasing something that just adds zinc or just adds boron or just adds molybdenum to your soil. So good diverse compost with lots of good diverse inputs operated and turned properly or purchased from a nursery or reputable supplier can really add a wide array of things to your soil all at once, and it's mostly beneficial. And, you know, beyond the nutrients and helping to break up the soil and retain water, you know, that compost is chock full and very supportive of beneficial bacteria and fungi, which are very important for healthy soil. So all the activity that's happening in the compost bin to break down that material, you're moving that and boosting your soil with it. So it really is the best bang for your buck. But if you want to buy something that's specific, you know, you may want to look at things targeted to the nutrient that you want. So in this case, we're looking at phosphorus, soft rock phosphate. It's a mined phosphate material, so they dig it out of the ground and they sell it, and it's essentially pure phosphorus. That's what you see the numbers on the surface there on the bag. It says 030. So when we say NPK, a lot of times on bags, they'll be labeled in 3 numbers. Nitrogen first, then phosphorus, then potassium. So this you can see really has no nitrogen or potassium at all. It's just phosphorus. So it's a very targeted amendment. It's natural. So again, like we were talking about a couple slides ago, it doesn't have an impact quite as quickly. It'll take some time to sort of build into your soil and be converted and absorbed by plants, but it'll last longer. So you'll see these kind of stretched out benefits from amending your soil with it. Another thing with phosphorus that we found in a lot of research is that if you add phosphorus, which you can also find in compost and other soil amendments, it has a tendency to bind itself to lead. And when phosphorus and lead bind together, that lead is a little less likely to enter a plant or be absorbed into your body if you happen to eat some or breathe some in. Lead phosphate is just a bit safer. It's not a cure-all. It's not something you should feel comfortable doing and then stepping back and assuming that you don't have to worry about lead anymore. But it's a benefit that you get by having an adequate amount of phosphorus in your soil. Another common organic amendment that we see is cottonseed meal. And it's a byproduct, so it would be a waste product if it wasn't used for this. And it comes from cotton processing. And it's kind of got a mix of minerals and organic ingredients in it. It has nitrogen in it, things with nitrogen in them, fertilizers in particular, and amendments, they tend to lower your pH. So you always want to be careful, and monitor your pH if you're going to be adding a lot of nitrogen to the soil. But some things like that, a slightly lower pH, especially if you don't have to worry about lead, is going to be great for things like blueberries and strawberries. And we add cottonseed meal as an amendment for turf and azaleas and roses. So it has its place, but as with anything that has nitrogen, particularly things that you're adding in quantity, you do want to be careful and monitor that pH, because if you do have lead in your soil, a lot of nitrogen can lower your pH, or too much sulfur can lower your pH, and that will make that lead more available. And you'll also lose some of your other nutrients as they free up and sort of leach down into the ground. Another one that we see that's really common, particularly among gardeners, is feather meal. This is, again, as you can see from the numbers on the front of the box, 1200, high levels of nitrogen. So this is one you do want to be careful with as well, because it is a great acidifier of soil. And so too much can really acidify your soil and cause all kinds of problems for your plants. It can do what's called burn your plants, just too much, they get too hot. And so you'll see a lot of damage to the plants, just an overload of nitrogen. But this is another waste product that has a lot of benefits. So if you do need to add nitrogen to your soil and you don't want to use a synthetic fertilizer, this is a natural source that you can use to get you the nitrogen boost that you need if a soil test shows that you're lacking. Another really popular one among organic farmers, in particular around here, is kelp meal. And this is just dried seaweed. It grows fast. It's very nutrient rich. It's, you can eat kelp, and in this case, it's ground into a powder that's very fine, and it's got loads of macronutrients. This particular one, has some nitrogen and potassium in it, but it really has something like 65 to 70 different micronutrients and other compounds in it. So it can be a good source to boost your soil. And it's very encouraging for soil bacteria, helps to kind of stabilize your pH. It doesn't have too much nitrogen, so you don't have to worry quite as much about an overload of nitrogen, acidifying your soil or burning your plants. It's flexible. You can surface dress, so you can kind of work it into the top of the soil around your plants. You can incorporate it, kind of dig it into the plants. Or some farmers do, they found ways, you can mix it with water and run it through irrigation lines. You have to be careful. You don't want to gunk up your irrigation lines if you're somebody that, puts tape out and things to water your plants with ease, but it is something that, that has a lot of benefit. It's fairly sustainable and, not too expensive and gets good results for a lot of people. The last thing we'll talk about in terms of kind of purchasing amendments is inoculants. And, the other ones we're kind of looking at chemical amendments to soil. And this one is sort of improving soil biology. So we're amending the biological functions of the soil. And essentially what these are either kind of liquid or powdered forms that you reconstitute in water, amendments of, bacteria and fungi that you can add to the soil, and they can give you benefits in terms of helping push back against, predatory diseases or even, bacteria and fungi that are bad. These good ones can help, attack them or protect your plants more. Some cases, certain fungi, metarrhizum in particular, has been shown to kind of help facilitate those lead and phosphorus bonds that we talked about a little bit ago. So it can be, a nice partner if you're trying to lower your, your lead risk a little bit by adding some phosphorus to the soil, and then maybe, making sure that there's a lot of, fungi and bacteria there to kind of assist the natural processes. It should be noted though that, metarrhizum and some of these other, biological, beneficial biologicals can be found in compost too. So you may get the benefits you get from some of these, purchased products just from adding compost that's well made. But typically when we talk about inoculants, we divide them into two categories. They're biofertilizers, or plant growth promoters, or they're biopesticides, which are kind of helping, your plants to resist, any sort of predatory diseases or microbes that are in the soil. The last thing is not so much an amendment like the others, but it's a strategy, and it can also add beneficial nutrients and improve soil structure, and that's cover crops. And the idea around cover crops is simply that soil is healthy when it has plant life growing in it. And microbes and fungi and other soil, micro and macro organisms, they really do typically exist well in soil that has life in it, and life being surface plants. And so the idea behind cover crops is, I've grown my vegetables for the year and now the season's done, but there's a little time left, and wouldn't it be great to have roots and plant life in this soil throughout the fall and winter, so that when I come back next spring and look to plant my vegetables again, this soil hasn't just been laying bare and uncovered the whole time since I finished my gardening. And so they can be really great because they can help encourage continuous and healthy soil biology. The roots get down in the soil and help to build structure and create space for air and water and nutrients to travel down through the soil profile. Certain cover crops, are nitrogen fixing. So you think about legumes like peas or clover, and these can help to fix atmospheric nitrogen down in your soil. So they can actually save you money on nitrogen fertilizer down the line. You won't need to add as much to your soil if you can use the off season to help kind of build some up. They come in a wide variety of options depending on the season, the needs, the timing. Some are very quick, and people will put them in the spring before they plant their normal crops. Some are put in at the fall and die naturally over the winter. You just kind of, incorporate or chop off the tops and compost the tops and separate the seeds out in the spring. Some are pretty resilient and they don't die. Things like ryegrass, if you plant it in the fall, it's going to survive the winter, and you're going to, need to spend quite a bit of effort getting it out before you put your vegetables in the following spring. But there's a whole array of cover crops and strategies. People have been mixing them, sometimes 6, 8, 10, 12 different cover crops to have a really diverse set of plants growing in the soil. And NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Purdue Extension, Penn State, and loads of other organizations have guides and information. And we'll link to a couple of the better fact sheets and quick guides. So if you're interested in maybe trying out cover crops this fall after you've finished your gardening, or maybe in anticipation of planting a new garden in a space next year and you just want to get something going now, you can refer to these guides and get some more information on the cover crops. So the last thing that we're going to touch on here is dealing with lead. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about lead because there are a multitude of kind of strategies that are more technical and not really recommended for most people. In general, when you get a lead test back, you're going to want to know how much lead is in there, and you can kind of break up what to do then into 3 broad categories. When we look at lead levels, especially here in the state of Pennsylvania, if you're in California, they have slightly different standards, but these are essentially modeled on, Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection and EPA standards. And essentially, we talk about lead, like many nutrients, in parts per million. So out of a million parts, what is the composition of lead? And so below 150 parts per million, that's what we consider to be relatively low risk. Urban background levels in the city are somewhere around 125 to 130 on average. Naturally occurring lead in the countryside around here may be between 20 and 50 parts per million. So we start to get above that, but still under 150, and we think of that as relatively low risk. Incorporate some compost, make sure the soil's healthy. You'll dilute that number a bit, and you can, generally speaking, feel comfortable growing as long as you wash your hands and wash your vegetables before you eat them. Medium risk is between 150 and 300, say, and there you might start to think about, not growing lettuce or carrots or root vegetables and stick with things like tomatoes and bell peppers and other types of fruiting crops. As you start to get up over 400, though, now it becomes high risk. Here in the city, generally speaking, over 400, the recommendation is to either cap and cover the soil, use a raised bed, or do some serious work to amend it. And then over 1,000 parts per million is very high. Over 400 is where you really, really start to worry about kids being exposed to the soil. But over 1,000 is where we really, really start to worry just about anybody working in the soil. It's not that uncommon to see levels this high, particularly next to older houses with paint or on vacant lots. So that's why in the city it is so common to see raised beds, because as you're worried about these higher numbers, it makes the most sense just to cover the whole site safely and then go up and build raised beds and mulch around. But when we talk about strategies to deal with lead, we break them up into 3 categories. We either avoid the soil altogether, which is the cover or cap methods that we talked about, where you just create a separation barrier between you and the soil, or in extreme cases, you would just excavate and remove that contaminated soil and bring something clean in. If you want to just mitigate your risk to lead, you may decide to just, especially with lower levels, you might just want to wash your vegetables or mulch heavily around all of your plants. Avoid growing greens or root vegetables and sticking to tomatoes and bell peppers and cucumbers. Really just being careful not to come into direct contact with the soil. And then the last is remediation, and that is amending, diluting, and immobilizing. And so these are the more technical ones, but that's where you start to add stuff to either lower the amount of lead, immobilize that lead, or add other nutrients to maybe mess with the pH so that it's nice and neutral and you don't have to worry about acidic soil freeing up a lot of the contamination. I'm going to have a bunch of resources that we're sending out to everybody, all about soil testing, general soil info, amendments, cover crops, and a couple special documents on urban soils and lead. So if you're worried about digesting all this information, we'll be sending it all to you in an email format, probably tomorrow morning, along with a survey and some other information so that we can continue to improve our programming. And if we want to get into the weeds on any of these topics a little deeper, we'll know that from your survey responses. And with that, I'm done. And I apologize for running a little long. We tried to cover a lot of material today, but my contact information is here. And I believe Amy's going to manage the questions for us right now, and we'll try to answer them if we have a few.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we have a couple questions. The first is related to compost. I use coffee grounds in my pots and beds. Is that a good idea?
So yes, I mean, coffee grounds are particularly fine. A lot of composters like community gardens in this area will partner even with local coffee shops to get all of their compost or all of their coffee grounds to add to compost. The one thing to think about with compost is that, like anything else, too much of a good thing. You don't want to just bury your garden in it. Compost or coffee grounds have kind of a specific carbon to nitrogen ratio as well. Typically, they're about 20 to 1. So coffee grounds make good compost additives because they have about 20 times the carbon to the amount of nitrogen. Ideal compost is probably going to be a little bit more like, say, a little bit higher, maybe like 25 to 1. So, if you are using compost, make sure you're using other stuff too, because it's not by itself with just some twigs and things going to be the ideal. So it's great to use. It's a great base. It's a great additive for compost. You can even sprinkle it around your garden, but just make sure if you're composting, you don't just use that as the sole source of like refreshing material.
All right. Question 2. What is used to cap soil? How could someone tell if there's a cap on the land they want to garden on? If someone has already capped the soil, so you could avoid digging deep.
Well, there's 2 ways. I mean, one, if it was a site that was like contaminated and it was capped like as part of an official cleanup, there would usually be some sort of a barrier designating that you're leaving the capped soil and entering the contaminated soil. So maybe a plastic or a heavy fabric or something that you would have to punch through to really see that you were in the contaminated soil down below. In general though, I mean, without like the history that you may get from other people on the site, you would see as you start to dig out, because say you have 2 feet of clean soil capped on top of a contaminated site, you would see the distinction between that original soil and what was brought in. It would be a kind of fairly horizontal defined layer. So that's kind of the easiest way to tell. Like if you start digging and suddenly the soil looks very different, which it will at a certain point naturally, but if it seems as though maybe there is some surface soil, like with a little organic matter on top, and then the things you would expect to find on the surface, but you're seeing it 2 feet under the ground or a foot under the ground, that's probably a cap situation, because what was the surface is now below the surface. So it really is, if you don't hit a layer, you often will be able to see the difference, because let's say there was some grass there and they just dumped a bunch of clean soil on top, that grass will decompose and break down, and you'll get these weird layers that look like they should be at the surface but are much further.
Okay, the last question I have right now, what are your thoughts on grubs?
What are my thoughts on grubs? Just that I don't like them in my garden necessarily, along with certain other things. They can be damaging and destructive pests. There's a couple different ways to think about grubs. There are some inoculants that can help with grubs. There are some natural predators that you can introduce into the environment, or encourage things like birds and stuff that will feed on them. There are a number of different strategies. I think there's a few that I could recommend, but I don't want to just say them off the top of my head. So what I'll do is I'll add them into the email and just have a category that says common pests and their management. And I'll have a couple of links in there that you can follow. So there's some good tips for, either using natural predators or messing with the composition of the soil and chemistry of the soil to kind of make it less hospitable for grubs.
Okay, and another one pop up here. I've been container gardening for 3+ years now with the same soil. Every year adding an organic and aerating component every year along with some new soil. Do you have any suggestions on rotating soil or anything else you could do to help add to the yield?
Well, I mean, it seems as though you're doing some good management. I mean, container gardening is always tough because it tends to be somewhat small spaces. And so even though you're adding, you know, if it's simply a smaller container, you know, sometimes that can be a limited environment. And oftentimes it's just diminishing returns, even if you work a little compost into it. So you may want to take, say, what's in your container and just incorporate it somewhere, you know, in the yard or and freshen that container up. But if it's a large container and you really don't want to, say, empty it or dump it out, I would recommend just getting a soil test, you know, and think that you're mixing the container up. So you can either till the whole thing up and then, you know, so the entire container is mixed and then just take a couple scoops off the top. Or if you haven't mixed it and you're trying to keep it relatively stable year to year, you're just sort of working some compost on the surface, then dig a little deeper down to the bottom of the container and take a soil test sample from there and send it off for a test. But in general, a lot of the kind of community gardens and you know, nonprofit gardening associations in this area will replace that soil after a while. They tend to see diminishing returns, you know, between 3 and 5 years. Some of them, they'll either just keep pumping in compost or sometimes they'll replace it.
Okay, that's all the questions that have popped up so far. So last call if anybody has any final thoughts. If not, we'll, thanks, John. That was a great presentation.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for tuning in. And like I said, we certainly will send out an email and a survey tomorrow. Please do fill out the survey. We're somewhat new to webinars at the Conservation District, so we would really love to hear your thoughts on what went well, what didn't, what you liked, what you didn't, and ideas for future webinars, because it seems like we're going to have some time on our hands and we want to make sure it's productive. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a great day.